Thanks everybody for coming. It's great to see such a diverse group. I've seen some people here this morning that weren't at some of our previous sessions, and I love it when we get different engagement from across the college, and a number of students here as well that are engaged with our applied research projects. Welcome. It's great to see you. My name is Jonathan Hack. I'm the Dean of Centennial Innovates, which is our applied research, innovation, and entrepreneurship department at the college. I'm thrilled to be here this morning. I'm really excited about this session. Here's our land acknowledgement for Centennial College. Centennial College is proud to be a part of a rich history of education in this province and in this city. We acknowledge that we are on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and we pay tribute to their legacy and to the legacy of all First Peoples of Canada as we strengthen ties with the communities we serve and build the future through learning and through our graduates. Today, the traditional meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the communities that have grown up in the treaty lands of the Mississaugas. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people, and we accept our responsibility to honor all of our relations. We recognize that Indigenous perspectives provide immense value to sustainable development, and that reconciliation is integral to holistically advancing sustainable and social innovation. Presently, Indigenous communities remain underrepresented in applied research, innovation, and entrepreneurial fields. Educational institutions that are grounded in equity, diversity, and inclusion are foundational to spark conversations, amplify voices, hold space for collective action, and empower underrepresented groups to enter these fields. So again, welcome. Just in terms of a quick update, in terms of what's been going on within the Centennial Innovates team, I'm really thrilled that we were able to submit 5 social innovation research proposals to NSERC earlier this month. Daniel Huizinga, congratulations on some stellar work. And also Poonama Tiagi, who put one together herself in her spare time, which isn't very much. And one of the things I'm really excited about is increasingly we're looking to partner with Indigenous organizations. And so at our last breakfast session, we had the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology here. We've had Inspire here, and we've talked to both of them subsequent to those meetings, and we have them engaged in meaningful conversations around future research initiatives and how do we partner more fulsomely with Indigenous organizations and really walk the talk in terms of what we're doing here at Centennial College. I've provided just a quick overview of myself. Thanks for coming today. This is a part of a monthly activity where we're looking to engage in conversations around differing perspectives, different learned experiences that we have, and how can we adopt best practices when we engage in research here at Centennial College. The last thing I want to mention is Eric and his team did a fantastic job. Last week, we did a final presentation to the NSERC expert review panel for the Hangar of the Future. And embedded right in that was a partnership with Inspire to take the technologies that we're developing through the Hangar of the Future here in Toronto and transferring those out to remote Indigenous communities. So when you think of fly-in communities and their reliance on air travel for inexpensive groceries, healthcare, you name it, they really need affordable air transportation. And if aircraft go down, that's an extreme hardship for those remote communities. And so we're engaged to ensure that we can provide as much quality to that experience as possible. So with that, our agenda for today, we have Larissa Crawford here, as you know. We're going to have breakfast and networking. We've already done that. Land acknowledgement and welcome. Larissa is going to do a keynote speech for us, and then we're going to have a workshop afterwards, and then a closing at 10:45. Vicky provided me a really nice introduction to Larissa. I've left it down at the table, but I just want to say that I'm really excited about today's session. We did a prep session with Larissa a week or two ago, and Larissa is the founder and managing director of Future Ancestors Services Incorporated. She identifies as Indigenous and Black and has some experiences as a person with a disability. What really impresses me about today's session is rather than talking about a single identity, we're going to be talking about the intersectionality of these different lived experiences and understanding how to provide services and where we fall short as a society in understanding comprehending and making fulsome, equitable services available for everybody. So I'm really excited about learning more from Larissa today. So Larissa, without further ado, welcome.
Hello, good morning. Thank you. I'll wait till the slides get up. Tase, Larissa Crawford Dishne, Goshen, Calgary Niwikan, puis mi famille Penetanguishin, puis Jamaica Niwikan. Bonjour, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. J'ai une ascendance métisse de Penetanguishin et une ascendance afro-caribéenne de Jamaïque. J'ai aussi de famille de nord de l'Alberta. Hey, I'm Larissa Crawford. I carry Métis ancestry from Penetanguishene and Afro-Caribbean ancestry from Jamaica. I pass this ancestry on to my 7-year-old daughter, Zaira, actually, who you can see in the next slide. Oh, awesome. Okay, perfect. Who you can see in the next slide. There's my little girl. And I'm really excited to be here. I also acknowledged I carry French Canadian ancestry, and that's always important for me to do, to hold space for all of my ancestry. And it's funny, to give you an idea of kind of my family, when I came out as bisexual and non-monogamous, my family didn't really care. They were like, okay, why are you telling us? And I come from a long line of northern like farmers and butchers. And so yeah, didn't care. But when I came out as vegan, y'all, that was a whole other conversation. And I love my family. I learn a lot from my family. I think about my family a lot, actually. I also carry a slave master name, Crawford. John Innes Crawford from Scotland owned several hundred slaves at Belfield Sugar Plantation in the early 18th century, 18th century. And so Crawford, that name that I carry, was a brand used to name my ancestors as property. And I think a lot about that. I think a lot about my family members who were Jesuits, priests who worked in residential schools. I think about my family members who went to residential schools. All of this really informs why I love research, why I love history, why I love this concept of innovation. I've been doing anti-racism and Indigenous research since I was very young. I've been doing it for over 15 years, and I just turned 29, so that's over half my life doing this work. I care a lot about it. I care a lot about how our lived experiences inform the policies and institutions that we navigate. I love understanding how we harm and how we restore relationships when we harm, despite intention. I really care about that. I've invested quite a bit of training too in conflict mediation and restorative circle keeping and restorative practice, especially from learning from Métis and Anishinaabe knowledge keepers from here. I did my undergrad at York University, so I lived here for about 6-7 years. And so that's kind of what brings me here. Again, I'm really passionate about this idea of research and innovation, and I'm really excited to be here to talk about it. Now, Future Ancestors Services, I guess we do professional services like speaking, training, research, and we use explicitly anti-racism and climate justice lenses in our work. We work with pretty much every federal ministry, a lot of policy, a lot of research to policy, and then policy to like implementation. And then we work with nonprofits, we work in community, and then we work with academic institutions in almost every province and territory in what is currently Canada. And this is important for me to name just because I really appreciate the intersectionality of the work that all of us do, the intersectionality of innovation and research. We can't just look at the sectors that we're working in. And that's exciting to me. And I also get to do my work with a group of really cool people. We all carry, we're all Black, Indigenous, and racialized at my company. Nearly all of us, actually all of us have a disability and or are neurodivergent. Most of my team is both, has both. And we're almost all queer. And it's really interesting. We all work in research and innovation, and a lot of our experiences up until we started working together was the invalidation of our lived experiences, was the denial of our knowledge because we were too young, because we look a certain way, because we carry a certain worldview. And that really informs kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, there we go. As in the description, what maybe brought you here, hierarchies of whose knowledge is considered unbiased and legitimate and whose knowledge is considered too spiritual and political are often informed by living legacies of colonialism. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how when we understand the legacies within which we are existing now, the legacies that we maintain, the legacies that we impose, or the legacies that we're resisting, when we better understand this, we are better situated to ensure that our innovation and research actually leads to the just sustainable futures we're all working towards. And that's the assumption I have coming into this room, is that we are all working towards that. And I also want to acknowledge the diversity in this room, and especially with regards to power. I love that there's students here. I love that there's staff, that there's educators, and that there's leadership. Because so often when I come in and do sessions like this, we don't see leadership. We don't see the people making a lot of final decisions in the room. And that can be very disempowering sometimes. So I also want to acknowledge and thank you for the time that y'all are here, that you're taking to be here today, because it makes me feel good about being here, but it also signals to those in the room that this is important, and that you do care about this, and having this kind of work translate into your work outputs. So thank you. Now, in terms of what I'm going to be speaking about, again, we have kind of a split session. And I just want to say, before even going into the outline, I'm really struggling today. I carry several chronic pain disabilities that affect my reproductive organs, but I'm also recovering from quite a severe brain bleed. And so the brain bleed, I lost a lot of my vision, a lot of my speech, a lot of my cognitive abilities. And today my brain is very inflamed. And so a lot of my symptoms are pretty bad right now. So low energy, my speech is a little patchy, or I might stutter or forget what I'm saying in the middle of a sentence. And so it's great that I have this comfort screen, thank you. Or you may find that, yeah, I might be a little rambly, and that just has to do with how the pressure in the front of my brain is affecting my cognitive abilities. So I'll just ask for patience for that today. And that's also kind of informed how I've set up today's session. I adjusted it a little bit, just kind of checking in with my own pain levels this morning. And so we're going to go through this content, but in the second part after the break, it is going to be a bit more, I'm going to hear from you, and then I'll present a bit more information. And so it's not typically how I would run a workshop necessarily session, but I still hope that you find the second part engaging, and the second part will be quite practical in terms of exploring relationship to time. So in terms of what we're doing, especially in this keynote, I want to talk about colonial worldview and hierarchies and truth in the context of research and innovation, in the context of our institutions. What is considered valuable knowledge and what is not, and why is that? And so I'm going to illustrate and connect some legacies and its consequences when applied in real life. And then I kind of want to get into a conversation about decolonizing and indigenizing as innovation. So often we talk about DEI, we talk about reconciliation as something, as a responsibility, as something we have to do. But when we think of this work, thank you. When we think of this work as innovation, it can shift our understanding of not only why this is productive and valuable to use our time to understand and actually do this work, but also we identify, again, how our innovation can truly address the root causes of why we need to innovate in the first place. And so that's why I want to talk about these kind of shared language pieces. And then critical exploration. How am I positioned in decolonization through my research and innovation? That's especially going to be the workshop piece, where we're going to critically apply and explore what we're going to talk about in the first two parts. So before I move on, are there any questions? Want to do a quick check? Awesome. I'm glad I made that clear. So why do we see worldview hierarchies in settler colonial states? Well, it's fun. It's funny. When we really think about why Canada was created as a nation state and why we saw colonial contact. We can argue gold, God, glory. If we get down to the root, interest, control of natural resources, extraction and exploitation of natural resources to inject into a growing imperial and eventually capitalist global economy. But that interest was to control natural resources. Now, this is a really important context to understand in what is currently Canada. Our nation state, our nation building was built around this mission to control natural resources, to extract natural resources in the interest of profit. Now, when we think of the word colonization, it's often a lot of negative connotations, and that's valid. But beyond it being bad, we aren't often encouraged to really think about, well, what are the consequences? And how has it shaped our realities today? And how is it shaping our realities today? Because the thing about the colonial project is that it never stopped. And so often we like to think that it stopped. And we like to talk about it as it stopped. And we use words like neo-colonialism or post-colonialism to suggest that it did stop. But what that does is it prevents us from really seeing how it not only has not stopped, but it's shaped and become normal in our truths and in our minds. And just like the transatlantic slave trade was not good, and we could see that looking back at it now, it was a normalized way of being. It was accepted as law, as policy. It was accepted as a societal norm and truth. And so when we think of when people look back at our norms and truths, what are they going to say? That's what I think of when I'm thinking of colonization is, what are our future generations going to see? What are the legacies we're leaving for those generations? Now, colonization, I don't want to get too into it. You're going to be able to get these slides. I had the QR code at the beginning. You're going to be able to scan them again at the break and at the end of this session. But I did want to just establish a little bit of understanding around what I mean when I say colonization. Now, I'm not imposing any of these definitions onto you. I'm not saying they're the only right way to understand these words, but to just establish some shared understanding, this is what I mean when I say colonization. So defined as control by one power over dependent area of people, but it really occurs when we see an alien nation come in and impose a whole way of being onto an indigenous nation for, again, the purpose of control, particularly around resources and extractivism. Now, it's both that physical and ideological, and that's what's important, I think, in really acknowledging the legacies is not only do we see our institutions, not only do we see our policies and the systems of governance that emerged in order to maintain this kind of colonial project, this colonial mission, but we also saw the ideological rationalization. So we need to make sense of this violence. We need to make sense of why some people are going to go into residential schools and some people aren't. We need to make sense of that. And that's where ideological domination comes into play. And we are all subject to it. We've all been influenced by it. Now, when we think of 4 common characteristics of colonialism, this list really helps me kind of explain the term, to understand the term in really practical ways. When we look at any colonial state, we're going to see 4 common characteristics. So political and legal domination over an alien society, relations of economics and political dependence. So we had complex economic and political processes in Canada as Indigenous peoples before colonial contact. Those had to be completely eradicated. That's actually where we saw the band council model come out, is to control the way we govern ourselves in a way that makes it easier to intervene and control us. And so economic and political dependence is incredibly important. When we think of the separation of land from land, where our economies were rooted, that was done to create economic and political dependence. Exploitation between imperial powers and the colony. But I really want to talk about racial and cultural inequality, because this becomes the basis, again, of the ideological domination, is understanding ourselves within a system and a hierarchy of value, essentially. Now, in Canada, we have settler colonialism, and that's colonialism done with the intent to naturalize people and settlers from the colonies as native to the land that they come to. And so Canada, US is kind of funny, but Australia, New Zealand, where we saw settlers come in and again, naturalize to become native to where they settled. Now, this idea of who is a settler is a conversation I just wanted to bring to the table. Again, not to impose a definition of who is a settler, who is not, but to inspire a bit of reflection on this, because this is really important when considering our roles and responsibilities within research and innovation, and to reconciliation, indigenization, decolonization. It's also important because I see a lot of people misuse or misidentify themselves as settlers when I really don't understand them as settlers, and where their roles and actions do not reflect those of a settler. And I also, before going through this, want to also share that the word settler, I think, for a lot of people can carry an air of guilt. And I don't want to inspire that when sharing this. And maybe to share a quick story. We all have a responsibility to this work. We all have a qualification to this work. I was emceeing quite a big sustainability conference. And I went on stage, did the opening. It was during the Wet'suwet'en solidarity movement. So I made some comments on that in my opening. And then an elder came on stage and they opened. And then this white guy in a suit came on stage and he did his speech. And it was the nighttime event. We were partying and some guy comes to me and he's like, I was so upset. I was so upset this morning. I was like, oh, here we go. But he was like, no, not at you. I was sitting at my table and these oil lobbyists, they saw you come on stage, they heard you open your mouth. And as soon as they saw you open your mouth, they picked up their phones and they stayed on their phone the entire time you spoke. When the elder came up, only looking at their phone, didn't pay attention. But when that white guy in a suit came on stage, they put down their phones and they listened the entire time. I was like, yeah, that sucks. That really sucks. I couldn't reach them because of how I look, because of the words that I was using. And I had stuck around to listen to this guy speak, and I said, well, did you actually hear what the guy said though? The guy in the suit. Everything that he was saying was very aligned and in support of everything that both I and the elder said on that stage. And so while we weren't able to reach those oil lobbyists because of how we look and because of who we are, he was able to reach them. And so when I think of this idea of understanding our identities and understanding how that positions us in our work, how I do anti-racism, how I do decolonization, how I do indigenization is going to look different than anyone. And it's the same for you. And so when I share and talk about identity in this way, it's not to say you're bad and you should always stay quiet. It's to underscore the responsibility of understanding your own identity and understanding how that positions you in this work. So that's why I'm presenting this part. And I'm actually just going to read these quotes because they're quite poignant. And again, I really just want you to reflect on kind of how you see yourself, or reflected in this or not. And hopefully providing some language to navigate these kind of conversations when you leave the space. So settlers benefit from the privilege of having their worldview imposed upon the lands and bodies of everyone living in these lands. As a default then, settlers are the norm, and everyone else, indigenous or not, must justify their existence, their worldview, through the lens of that dominating settler worldview. Settlers benefit from the privilege of not needing to be named, of not needing to justify their thoughts or presence, and this plays out in countless interactions. So for example, in 2019, there was a really interesting, and I wish I put the even picture, I wasn't planning on mentioning this, but there was a nursing textbook, an award-winning nursing textbook, and a section of it is cultural differences in pain communication. Again, 2017, in pain communication. And they section off this part of the textbook. When Blacks communicate about pain, they often over-exaggerate. They often think it's a religious reason, and they name all these cultural stereotypes. And they do this for indigenous people, for Jewish people, for Black people, for Latinos. And it's really problematic. But what's very striking about this little cultural pain communication table is that whiteness and white people are completely left out of that analysis. Because we're taught to see whiteness as the norm, because we're taught to see a settler worldview as the norm. So that naturalization. I'm gonna try. Next slide, thanks. I think the history of the term settler is Black and white, that I am Native and you are foreign, I am indigenous and you are settler. And that's true. The way it's been typically used historically is Black or white. You're a settler or you're not. But I think in the last few hundred years, the term has taken on a different layer where it also now means comfort of I've now settled in and I can erase the fact that I am foreign or different. And now I've taken it upon myself to build prisons and build walls and construct laws and taxes and forms of governance as if I am Native. Because I am settled, I am comfortable. I've been here long enough that I have somehow forgotten that I'm still foreign. The way that I like to illustrate this is when I go into a space, I'm especially like a research space, when I'm going in to do the research, I'm not going to be respected by default. And that's how I sometimes like to describe it, is that notion or that feeling that when you go into a space or when you go into a certain work, there's a foundational understanding of what you need to feel respected in that space, of what you need to feel like your worldview is validated or that your truths are valid in that space by default. And so that's how I understand this kind of idea of comfort. Originally, I used a binary wherein settlers were all non-Indigenous peoples. However, that approach is reductive and in some cases actively harmful, in my opinion. I specifically refer to settlers as the non-Indigenous people living in Canada who form the European descended socio-political majority, aka white people. Now I recognize that other people can come here and settle on these lands and be folded into the settler colonial project that is Canada. And so anyone can come here and engage in the harm that we experience from a settler worldview and system. Anyone can do that. And a lot of us do in unknowing ways. But settler colonials, by definition, occupy lands and impose their legal orders on everyone. Immigrants from Somalia, for example, do not do this. It's not a bright line definition. And so this is where I get hesitant to call people who aren't coming from these countries of colonial history and legacies in what is currently Canada and calling themselves settlers. It's because you're not coming here and trying to impose your truths onto me as the only truth. You're not systematically creating governance and laws and policies to make me exactly like you and invalidate the way I am. And I know putting that sounds extreme, but our experiences are extreme and have extreme consequences. Now, when we think of the characteristics of a settler worldview and what comes out of that identity and that tie and to that legacy, we can think of things like private property with an emphasis on ownership and control. We can think of individualism. We see this in oftentimes healthcare policies. You can take time off work to maybe support your partner, your common law partner, and your children. But as soon as you have to take care of an elder or an extended family member, it becomes very difficult in many healthcare policies to do so, to take time off for that. Because through this settler worldview, the nuclear family is the pillar of family structure. Urgency culture, I'm going to talk about that in a bit. Hierarchical organizational power structures. Now, there's nothing innately wrong with hierarchy, but oftentimes we see hierarchy used to cause harm through the imposition of control rather than responsibility to a group of people. And then privileging of Eurocentric standards and professionalism. Now, let me illustrate this maybe in a bit more of a practical way. In the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. So this is a quote from Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. Incredible book. I highly recommend if you're looking for an Indigenous approach to science and research. This is a very practical and quite funny book, I must say. And in this quote, she really expertly articulates worldview and consequential relationships. So in the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. So this is coming from a settler worldview, and we see this enshrined in our policies and our laws and how our society is structured. But to our people, it is everything: identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. So a worldview where we see Earth as an extension of self, where we see Earth as our economy, as our healthcare system, as our teacher, as our holder of language, as an extension, again, of self and culture. That shapes a consequential relationship to Earth. Now, often in research and policymaking, in academia, we position the first worldview as legitimate and as unbiased. Unbiased is thrown around a lot to identify settler worldviews. And what ends up happening is that Indigenous worldviews, like the second, are invalidated as biased, as too spiritual, or at best nice to have, but it needs to be validated through our worldview first. Now, I'm going to illustrate the consequences of when this happens and how this can happen. So in 2019, I was able to spend quite a bit of time in Yukon on a fellowship, a research and policy fellowship program. And we spent quite a bit of time in community, and I came across this woman who had worked on what I'm about to talk about. And it was the article that was included in the description of this event. So if you want to go back, the link is going to be in the slide deck, but it's also in the event description. And And this case study, one, I really like looking to the north for sources of innovation. We're seeing incredible innovation taking place with regards to approaches to research and with approaches to applying that research in community in ways that respond directly to the immediate needs, especially on the heels and within climate change. And so I really encourage you, and this is why I'm bringing a northern example here. It's because when we look to the north, we can gain so much insight and inspiration. So in 1948, the Champagne and Ashiek First Nations, as well as the Kluane First Nations, were removed from their land in very violent ways in the interest of a game sanctuary. So Government of Canada decided, okay, conservation efforts, we did our research, we're gonna remove people from these lands in order to protect nature, in order to conserve and protect the wildlife. And so this was used as a way to justify the violent removal of these people from their lands. And this is not uncommon across what is currently Canada. We've seen this in most, if not all, of our national parks and many of our provincial parks. And the basis for this, this removal, at the root of it, is Western scientific objectivity, particularly around this concept of terra nullius. So terra nullius was used to justify the doctrine of discovery. It was used to justify, oh, these people are here, but they aren't really using the land in a profitable way. They aren't using the land the way we would expect a civilized society to use it. So this is really no man's land. And so we can come in and control and take this. But this also, underlying this kind of concept of terra nullius is the understanding that wilderness does not, one, acknowledge Indigenous occupancy, but requires the removal of Indigenous people from that land. And that actually has to do with regards to what and who we consider within an ecosystem. This is actually, I talk about this a lot with veganism, actually, because a lot of vegan arguments are made on the basis of we shouldn't be engaging in these ecosystems. We shouldn't be exchanging energy in these ecosystems, in these circles of life. And the basis of that argument is understanding humans as separate from our natural ecosystems. If you look to a lot of high school biology textbooks, you very rarely see humans within the ecosystem. You often see us separate from or not at all mentioned. And that was the basis of creating these conservation efforts, was the assumption that in order to protect wilderness, humans had to be removed from that ecosystem. This allows us to mentally space ourselves, distance ourselves from the impact we have within an ecosystem, and allows us to see ourselves above these ecosystems. But the Indigenous peoples that were removed from these lands had always existed with an understanding and worldview that we are within an ecosystem, that we too are an apex predator and have a responsibility to our kin within these ecosystems, that we have an impact within these ecosystems. Now, by ignoring that, by saying, no, we're separate from, we need to be separate from, we're above, and therefore we need to protect in this way by removing Indigenous people from the land, what ended up happening is that they completely destabilized the ecosystem by removing an apex predator that had been within this ecosystem for time immemorial. And they saw an overpopulation of wolves. Again, destabilized the ecosystem. And this happened. Thank you. And this happened because time and time again, our worldviews were invalidated in the research and development process. In interviewing Robin Bradash, who did a lot of work with the restoration of relationships after this experience, shares, we were talking about reintroducing the original people to the park, and it was so frustrating to me that the scientists were not able to recognize that people had been removed and that had had an impact. Not only an impact on the land, but an impact on the people. There was such a lack of understanding around the true connection Indigenous peoples have with the land. So not only did ignoring and invalidating Indigenous worldviews in science, not only did the invalidation of us saying by removing us, you will destabilize the ecosystem and harmed the intent and mission of these interventions, but it was also not sustainable. And it caused real harm and cultural genocide to generations of people who lost access to their language, to their community, to their medicines. And in going and talking to people who have been affected by these policy interventions and this research, those impacts are still so present in their realities today because our worldviews were deemed as irrelevant and unbiased. Thank you. Now, why? Why is it so important? When we go back to the four common characteristics of colonialism, racial and cultural inequality is one of those necessitating elements for ideological domination. Now here, whether this is from Robin Wall Kimmerer again, whether it was their homeland or the new land forced upon them, land held in common gave people strength. It gave them something to fight for. And so in the eyes of the federal government, that belief was a threat. Let me read this next one. The rural enslaved population of the antebellum South had an intimate and cooperative relationship with the natural world, one that enabled them to develop critical skills that maximized their chances of successfully escaping slavery permanently. Further, the Southern plantation owners had increasingly removed themselves from the land and had a much more remote relationship with the natural world, a factor that made it more difficult for them to control their slave labor and find fugitives once they had escaped. So an Indigenous relationship to land, whether it was the transatlantic slave trade and the slave system that emerged from that, whether it was and is in the context of what is currently Canada, Indigenous relationships to Earth has been and always will be a threat in a settler colonial state. Land held in collective challenges private property, challenges the notion of private property and why we see a push for private property and individualism. Our economy, our politics, and our political systems, our laws are based in our connection to Earth. Removing us from that is destabilizing, is fracturing. Now, the opposing side of that, if we do have access, it is empowering. It allows us to organize. It allows us to develop generational wealth of knowledge that we have been denied and so actively targeted. Now, what happens and how does this happen in our spaces when we invalidate Indigenous worldviews? I'm going to share kind of what another worldview can look like. There's a word in my language that speaks to these issues, wakatoen. Today, it is translated to mean kinship, relationship, and family, as in human family. But at one time, for our place, it meant the whole of creation. And our teachings taught us that all of creation is related and interconnected to all things within it. Wakatoen encompasses the act of being related, or a worldview that everything is related, and a set of laws or obligations around how to conduct good relationships. How do we create space for this in our own research? What would be all the barriers to employing a worldview like this in how we approach our research? I can tell you there are a lot of barriers because I've been there. I've had to navigate those barriers. And I've been on research that specifically explores that in Ontario colleges and universities. I'm happy to talk about that during the Q&A if we want. But asking that question, looking at wakatoen, looking at this idea of interconnectedness and relationship, and oftentimes we see this when we try to get interdisciplinary with our research. So often our funding streams, where we can study and how we can bring those subjects together, it's often denied because we, through a settler worldview, do not see this work as connected. So that brings me to my point, decolonization and indigenization. How is it innovative? How do we overcome those barriers? How do we avoid those mistakes that I talked about with Kelowna National Park? How do we avoid those mistakes? So with Kelowna National Park, so in, I want to say, I'm not going to give the exact date. I'm sorry, that date escapes my brain right now. But eventually, Kelowna Game Sanctuary was made a national park. And they recognized, okay, this was wrong. It's not working. You guys come back. And no one came back. Because again, it was a very violent separation. There was a lot of trauma and there was a lot of mistrust. And so through a complex process, they identified, okay, let's have a co-management regime. Let's try to make this work. Now, again, there weren't the relationships or trust to be able to enact that co-management regime. And that's where Healing Broken Connections came out from 2024 or 2004 to 2009. We saw these really concrete efforts for restorative circle keeping and relationship building. Time was spent to build relationship. Time was spent to acknowledge harm, the harm of the research that had been done before and the implementation of that research. Now, it was very exciting what came out of this project. Not only a more functional co-management regime, but also a totally new field of ecological health indicators. We saw cultural reintegration, the return of original peoples to the land as an indicator of the park's ecological integrity. That was very exciting. And that was only done because they went through a process to indigenize the way that they were and are evaluating the success of this park's health. And for this groundbreaking innovation. Now, decolonization and indigenization are innovative. Innovation that remains true to the principles of colonialism and capitalism. There are limitations to how, again, effective, how sustainable that innovation can truly be. If we aren't asking ourselves, why do we need to innovate in the first place? What are we innovating for? Decolonization helps us in uncovering the why. Decolonization, sorry, helps us uncover the why. And indigenization creates space for a pursuit of a resolution in response to that why. And in doing so, creating space not only for new technology, not only for new discoveries, but for new applications of existing knowledge, for new applications of pre-colonial contact ways of being and ways of thinking. That is innovative. And so often we don't think about decolonization, reconciliation, indigenization as the innovative, as the incubator for innovation that it truly is. Now, I'm gonna go through the next few slides and then we'll have our break. With regards to decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation in our approach to innovation and research in particular. So if I'm to describe decolonization in a really practical way, decolonization is the process of uncovering and our understanding of colonial legacies and how they're shaping our realities today and how they've shaped our realities before. In understanding and identifying how colonial legacies are shaping the way we think of our future. It's about unpacking, so creating voids, essentially. And with indigenization, we like to fill and reshape those voids. That's how I like to think about it in a, again, more practical sense. I put the definition up here. I guess it is important to highlight that with decolonization, we need to start with our worldviews. Because again, colonial project, both physical and ideological domination. And the reason it's so hard to address that ideological domination is because it's been normalized as our truths. And so when we unpack that, when we start there, we're better situated, again, to understand why we need to innovate. Now, when I was a student at York University, I was really into the part of my research career that looked at data analysis and collection, particularly race-based data collection. And I became kind of accidentally lead of the university's efforts to develop a system to collect data and implement new policies from incoming students. So for the first time, collecting demographic data around age, sexuality, gender, etc. It was a big project, and it was a frustrating project. I'm going to illustrate why. So success in many academic institutions is often limited to student grades or employee scores, the number of people who enroll, profit, donations collected, social media following, even the number of Black kids we get into the school. That's often named as the success itself. So just maybe take a second and think of how you understand success in your work or your research. Success. Now, what ends up happening, especially again in these settler spaces and through a settler worldview, is that we're often positioning the tools to achieve success or that indicate success as the success itself. So, oh, we raised X amount of dollars. Oh, we brought in X amount of Black students. Awesome, our job is done. We did it. Because we aren't taught to ask about the relationships. We aren't taught to ask about the process. Okay, we got X amount of Black students in, but what was their experience? What was the quality of their education when they got in? Okay, we raised X amount of dollars, but what relationship did we establish with that organization or with that community in doing so? Yes, we collected this much data, but how is that data actually benefiting the community that we extracted that data from? And I saw this happen time and time again, where success in this space, in DEI, was to hold this program, to get this project off the ground. And yes, these are important, but this was not leading to the sustainable change that we argued for, or that we were saying we were working towards. Because success was limited to putting that on, to getting those kids in the door, without asking why did we need to do this work in the first place, and without asking how did we achieve this, and to what end with regards to the relationships we've created and navigate. Now, in this research, what ended up making it really effective and really exciting was the relational aspect that we brought to it. Actually, sorry, that's the next slide over. I will also say that with these spaces often, and what made this project very frustrating also, was who was defining the success criteria. It was interesting because I often went into these meetings excited about the leadership and excited about we have X amount of women in these leadership roles. It's so exciting, yay. But then when it came down to actually doing these meetings, every single meeting started with justifying that racism exists in the university, never mind in the province, never mind in Canada. Explaining what racism is, explaining how students and staff experience it at the university. And it became an extreme hindrance to applying or even talking about any of the research that we had. Because none of these leadership, no one in these leadership roles were asking themselves, what lived experiences do I have and not have, and how is that shaping my decisions in approving or hampering this work? And how am I working to resolve those gaps in my understanding? And so, yes, there were a lot of women, but they were exclusively white women that had never engaged with this kind of work, that had never asked themselves the question of race in Canada. And so the people defining what success was did not have the qualification to do so and to honor their responsibility to the Black students, the non-white students in the university. And it halted our research and the application of it. Now, our research and understanding how that worldview, because again, there we go. In doing that work, it was the worldview and an ignorance of the worldview and how it was shaping their decision making that ended up halting, again, a lot of really good research and work. And so when we think of our own research and worldview, these are some of the questions that I really wish these administrators would have asked themselves. And it was questions that helped us navigate how do we structure these conversations in a way that can help us move beyond the barrier that this worldview hierarchy is creating. Whose knowledge and what kind of knowledge does your research and evaluator position as valuable and credible? Does your research or evaluator position knowledge as unbiased or objective? Why? What makes other knowledge biased or unobjective? It's a really interesting question when I started asking that in these meetings. Really interesting. How can an evaluator worldviews affect, how can evaluator worldviews affect the reception of your research? How can you prepare to address concerns derived from a worldview hierarchy? So this is a question I ask myself before going into those spaces. It's coming in prepared to ask those questions and prepared to supplement gaps in an ability to respond to those questions. Now, indigenization, the naturalizing of indigenous worldviews, the naturalizing of our practices is where we saw a lot of success in this research and helped us overcome some of those barriers. And it had to do with framing success relationally. So when working with students and in engaging with students to understand, what do you want from this demographic data collection? What does success look like to you? And how do you want this information used? We were able to identify an incredible engagement process informed by relational expectations and success criteria. And when doing in this particular field with race-based data collection, that is paramount in being able to collect effective data and translate that into the policy governance research. Now, success. What do healthy and ethical relationships look like with regards to our organization's relationship to earth, profit, students, community? This is where we see relational success emerge. This is where we can start identifying how our relationships can be defined as the success itself, creating space for a worldview like Wakatoan. At Future Ancestor Services, we have a strat planning approach, relationship-centered strategic planning. And we go into organizations and we do exactly this. We ask that question of, what do these healthy relationships look like in your research? And it's really interesting. We start with relationship mapping, so we ask those questions. And then we ask, okay, what are pathways to honoring these relationships and the success of these relationships? And that's when we get into the more practical planning. But this is this became and is an indigenized approach to strategic planning, to research planning. And it's really interesting because these clients see an incubator for innovation here, because we're shifting our understanding of success. We're indigenizing our understanding of success. We're localizing it to our work, to our communities, to our team. And we're able to pursue this research in a way that, again, addresses the root cause of why we need to innovate in the first place. Thank you. So this question of, how have you been successful in fostering healthy, ethical relationships? What do successful relationships look like after your research is put into practice? Who's involved in defining this success? How does your research hold space to be iterative as your understandings of success change? And then how often will you be monitoring your research success? So if we think of all the barriers that may exist for you being able to answer or structure your research or work in this way, is a really interesting place to start. When we're asking these questions, what would be the reality of applying these questions and insights to what we're doing right now? And oftentimes when I ask these kind of questions in academic institutions, there's a lot of barriers. But I like to think of those as real sites of opportunity, again, for innovation, the idea of doing something differently. And I know I'm talking to a room full of experts in innovation. But this is a way that I like to see and broaden the scope of what we mean when we say innovation. Innovation is not only born from technological advancements. When we hold space and go back to apply our ancestors' traditional knowledge to our contemporary realities, we have the opportunity to learn from their actions and inactions and find innovation in justice and accountability across past, present, and future generations. So this idea of ancestral accountability to our work, our accountability to the legacies we leave through the way we are innovating, through the questions we are asking and not asking in our work, in our understanding of innovation. And so I'm going to pause here because I know I just downloaded a lot. And I know we've got about half an hour left. If you want to scan the slides before the break or during the break, you can use that QR code. It's going to pop up at the end of the deck as well. But maybe I'll signal because we're going to do a Q&A. And then for the rest of the session, we can kind of go two ways. It can be a pick your own adventure. We can kind of go into a dialogue, or I can share more information about decolonizing time and making this work aligned with our understanding of productivity and a valuable use of time. So I'll check in with y'all after the break, but maybe we can do a 5-minute break instead of a 10-minute break. And if we could come back on the 17-minute mark of the hour, so it's 10:12 right now, if we could come back at 10:17 with your questions ready, and then kind of an understanding of if you want to go into a shared dialogue, or if you would like to go into a bit more content before wrapping up today. So enjoy your break, get your tea. I highly recommend the cedar tea at the back. It's really good. I don't know how much is left because I've been chugging it back, but enjoy your break and I'll see you in a few minutes. Hello, y'all. If you could start making your way to your seats. I know the natural light out there looks so nice. I'm sorry. And maybe as y'all are making your way back to your seats and back to the headspace, if anyone has any questions before we keep on keeping on in, I'm happy to answer any questions at this point too, before and as people are coming back. Do we have a mic for questions? Yeah, Zach. Oh yeah, there's a question all the way down there.
Thank you so much, Larissa. It's been an amazing presentation, and I've really enjoyed listening to you speak and the visuals that accompany it. So thank you. My question is in regards to your experience at York University and I think you were trying to shift the application process and also indicators of success. And I think it's funny enough because I actually work outside of Centennial College.
Yeah.
But for those of us that do work, I imagine it's the same because I've worked in other higher education institutions. There's layers of bureaucracy with revising or transforming those things. So I would love to hear what that process was like of being able to do that. If you could share a bit about that.
Yeah, and that's actually where those questions came from, especially like the second set or the first set around worldview and research, because it was happening at every level. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the people that were in these decision-making positions had no experience in understanding race in Canada and why this work was important, not from lived experience or education. And so when it came to the technical conversations, it was always, most of the conversation was, yes, we experience racism here in Canada. Yes, this policy is creating a racial inequity in how we're accepting students. Yes, what's happening outside of school, right, outside of our institution right now is affecting how students can come to this space. And so this idea of responding to and acknowledging our role in these barriers was the conversation every single time. And so it was very laborious, and we actually weren't successful in a lot of our efforts because of that. And so it was after this program and after leaving the university that I really thought through the kind of questions that would have helped us address the acknowledgement that it wasn't our responsibility to educate them in that moment. And that those were the kind of questions that I now use to bring that up, to illuminate, oh, like, you're actually not really aware of the position that you're coming from and how that's halting this research. But let me ask you a question so you can come to that understanding yourself. And I'm giving you the opportunity to help you along the way. But in answering those kind of questions, what I find in my work is that that helps move the conversation along. And so that's why I shared those questions, because it's hard. And having leadership, and that's why I acknowledged like the fact that there's so much leadership in this room right now, is because it's usually at that level that I experienced a lot of barriers, but it was because they weren't interested in these kind of conversations. They didn't think that this kind of work was important or relevant to what they were doing. And so, again, that's also why I acknowledge how much leadership is in the room, because that is something time and time again when I'm working with students. And my responsibility in doing this work is to the students. My responsibility in doing this work is to the people that are harmed by these institutions, where these institutions weren't made for us. That's who I'm responsible to in doing this work and making this presentation. And I really appreciate those who showed up today in making that responsibility a little bit more achievable, I guess, in honoring. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer.
No, it was perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions before? I'm going to do another question check at the very end. But at this point, how are we feeling energy-wise? Would you like to hear about time and productivity? I'm seeing some heads. Yeah, okay. I had a feeling. It's also, depending on how you structure your day, can be early. I got in late last night, so again, my energy's a little low. But I really also do love this next part. And it has to do with how am I positioned in decolonization through my research and innovation. And so this is where I'm going to talk about time and productivity, my absolute favorite area of research, especially in the context of academia. And so I just want you to, I'm not going to do a group dialogue here, but this is a great question to go back and ask your teams, to go back and ask the people that you work with. What opportunities do you have to reorient criteria for success and innovation in your research and institution? Who needs to be involved in doing so? So this is actually informed by, has anyone heard of the book Order Out of Chaos by Scott Walker? It's really interesting on negotiation and conflict resolution. Every book I read, I always read one that I think I'm going to really align with, that's going to speak to my worldviews, my experiences. And then every other book, I have to read one that I think I'm not going to agree with, or I don't identify with the author or their position. And that was one where I actually thought I wouldn't agree with a lot of what he said, but I actually did. And it was really interesting. But this question emerged from some of his perspectives on conflict resolution. And making order out of chaos and reorienting our perspective on barriers into an opportunity and a site for innovation. How do you align the opportunities to reorient criteria for success and innovation in your research and institutions as productive and valuable use of our time? So essentially, how do we reorient DEI, reconciliation, anti-racism work as productive, no matter our sector, no matter the nature of work that we're doing, as a valuable use of our time? And that's often when it comes down to when we're handing out resources, when we're saying, yes, take the time to do this. It comes down to what we think is a productive use of our time, a valuable use of our time. Oftentimes, relationship building and nurturing, time for meals, time for breaks, these are often not regarded as productive and end up harming our work outputs. Now, our relationship to time is so interesting. And it comes back to this idea of colonial legacies, the colonial legacies we're living in today. Our relationship to time and productivity is not neutral. And it is very historically rooted in colonialism. And it's really interesting. And especially coming off the heels of Black History Month, it's very relevant to Black history. It's very relevant to Indigenous history. I see all of my ancestors reflected in this history. So by the beginning of the 19th century, we see a growing cross-section of British society that's seeing, okay, civilization, true religion, means accurate measurement and profitable use of time. And there was a lot of intention behind this. With the transatlantic slave trade, we're stealing Indigenous people from Indigenous lands, bringing them to stolen Indigenous lands for the purpose of natural resource extraction and control, and pumping raw materials into a growing imperial and, again, eventually capitalist global economy. And so we see this growing economy. We're seeing factories emerge. We're seeing a whole system creating an economy that is dependent on exploiting humans as a natural resource as productively, as profitably as possible. And so in order to do that, we need to control the time that they're in our factories, the time that we're able to do that. And so there's a lot of different motivation. But in order to ideologically make this make sense, let's align this with true religion. Let's align this with our understanding of civilization. This is civilization. Now, it's interesting because we're also seeing the age of enlightenment really take root in mainstream consciousness, especially around this idea of human rights and freedom and equality. But there was a really interesting ideological contradiction that was emerging during this time. With the transatlantic slave trade, we see some of the worst acts of humanity against humanity take place, both from stealing Indigenous peoples and also controlling the lands on which these people are coming to. So how do we rationalize that? Human freedom, human equality, true religion, and then also what we're doing to these people. There's an ideological contradiction, and colonialism requires ideological domination, not contradiction. And so there were a lot of different ways that this contradiction was resolved. One was phrenology, race science, which was positioned as unbiased, which was positioned as legitimate, but emerged from the need to rationalize, oh, these people, they're actually closer to animals. They're not fully evolved humans. So it's okay if we do this to them. They don't fall under our definition of who has a human right and who doesn't. They're closer to animals, so it's okay. These people, they're fully evolved humans. That's why they got rights. And so race science was used to justify the transatlantic slave trade, was used and is used to justify our residential school system. Our relationship to time, oh, I'm missing a couple slides. Our relationship to time, here, I'll go here. Our relationship to time was used in this way. When we saw colonial contact, settlers saw our people taking naps, resting, not eating 3 meals a day. They saw us telling time by the sun. They didn't see punctuality as the pillar of our societies. And so they saw this as phrenology to use as a justification for our dehumanization, for our colonization. My ancestors were colonized, and our relationships to time were used to justify that violence. These people need true religion. They need civilization. They're savages. Look at them. They aren't using these resources the way they could be. They're sitting on immeasurable wealth. They need to be taught how to use that wealth in our interest. And so time was used to justify our colonization. Now, we see this, oh, I'm going the wrong way. We see this legacy in our time today. Indian time, African time, island time. When you think of these relationships to time, what kind of stereotypes do we usually assign to Indian time, African time? When people show up late, what is our immediate thought? Yeah, exactly. That they're lazy, that they don't care. It's often in very negative connotations. So steady urgency culture, we see that in our day-to-day academic spaces because we need to be as profitably, we need to use our time as profitably as possible. When we think of steady urgency culture and accurate measurement of time and projecting our expectations of how you use your time onto all without resolve, we see this often in the classroom. Your peers were able to do it in time. Why weren't you? Oh, you have a learning disability? That's too bad. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but the amount of students who specifically come with this issue is far more widespread than we'd like to admit. And that's rooted in urgency culture. Time for rest, being on the land, and health-related activities are not prioritized as valuable or productive. How often do we take our classes outside? How often do we take the teachings of the land and of earth to inform our understanding, our truths, our research? Time needed for emotional recovery from racism and discrimination is not regarded as valuable or productive. This is a horrible reality in academic institutions that is leading to a statistical disparity where I am less likely to reach my natural end because of the chronic state of stress I am in because of racism and discrimination in institutions. That is a statistical health disparity. And it is because we're not acknowledging that time to recover from that is valuable or productive. I've landed myself in 2 life-saving surgeries because I was not given time to recover, because I was not given space for medical accommodations, because expectations of time were imposed onto me without consideration of my needs, my circumstances. It has been life-threatening, this imposed relationship to time and urgency culture. Now, with temporal decolonization, I put in brackets. I use this word to just describe that we can also decolonize through our relationships to time. And that's where I get so excited. Just as much as it's been used to control and colonize me and my ancestors, I use it as a way to navigate those barriers. So at Future Ancestor Services, we have a seasonal work cycle. So our quarters are aligned with the equinoxes, and the solstices. And this is part of our strategic planning. I don't usually share our actual strategic planning process, but I thought it would be useful and practical today, where we ask ourselves, how are we working with the natural world? Because pre-colonial contact, our ancestors didn't work with the same energy all year round. The way that we worked and the kind of work and productivity that we did was aligned with the natural world and how it shaped our bodies, how it shapes our environments. I have several people on my team who experience chronic depression. And during the winter seasons, during the cooler seasons where there's less sun, they really struggle. And so asking this kind of question, what do we need throughout the year? How does demand for our work, how does demand from our bodies, and how does the environment shape those demands happen in each season? And this is actually where we start our planning, is having awareness of how the natural world impacts us. And then we go on to ask, okay, what work do we need to do in each season to honor both our needs and our demands? The way I like to describe this in a really short way is ensuring that our peak productivity and productivity in terms of our work, making sure we're matching that with peak rest. And this enables us to do so, where we can look at the season and recognize, okay, we need more rest during the winter and summer months because of how intense the spring and fall are. And we're able to plan for that rest within the parameters and limitations that we have. We're able to consciously create a space to ask, how are we resting? How are we spending time on the land? Because we recognize that no matter what kind of research or policy work we're doing, our relationship to Earth is going to be relevant in that work. So how do we honor that? So I have a couple kind of pieces here. There's more as we go on. But this idea of creating space for this work in your minds and in your workplaces, a way that we can really address the root cause of, again, why we need to do this work, but also where we may be contributing to barriers, is rooted, again, in our worldview. And our relationship to time is a really practical way that we can begin addressing and seeing our roles and positioning ourselves in these colonial legacies to the benefit of not only the people we're working with, but very importantly, ourselves. And so there's two articles here, Reimagining Care and Healing. That's an article I did specifically in the context of disability and rest and how I started to reorient my personal relationship to Earth. Whereas time is a colonial structure construct, here's how I learned to reclaim mine. That's more so in a workplace research kind of context. And so that's also an article that you'll be able to get. And then these are the two questions that we do in a seasonal work cycle planning session. How do the seasons correspond with our energy, health, and demand throughout the year? What kind of work should be done in each season? And so these are questions that you can bring to your research team, that you can bring to your team that you work with, that you can apply to your own life. And I do a personal seasonal cycle kind of work plan, and I check in at the beginning of each season. And this really helps me orient my relationship to Earth as a productive use of my time, as an innovative use of my time and way of understanding time. A question that these kind of questions really helped me start doing so, and I see it really help other people do so. Helps our team too. These are questions we ask anyone who comes into our team, often our clients, the people that we're working with, we often ask these kind of questions. So what can you do to align your relationship to time with your understanding of successful health, with your understanding of innovation, with your understanding of research? What are the impacts of your current relationship to time on your health or on your research or on your innovation, on your capacity to do your work sustainably? What is a valuable use of time to you? What is a productive use of time to you? Again, where I see a lot of barriers when I'm doing this work is because DEI reconciliation work is not regarded as productive. It is regarded as taking away from productivity. What could be the consequences of honoring your health and relationship to time? So in restructuring a research proposal or project or work plan or timeline, What's a consequence of adjusting them to honor a relationship to time? For me, when I ask myself that question, it looks like losing out on contracts. It is expensive to be disabled for a lot of different reasons. Lost opportunity and income is a big one. And that's what happens when I honor my relationship to time. And I have to be honest about that. And I can't always honor my needs in relationship to time. There are times where I have to push through. But again, coming back to that idea of matching peak productivity with peak rest productivity, another kind of productivity, can really help me get through those moments where I can't honor my needs for rest, where I can't honor my valuable uses of time. Okay, I'm really peaking at work productivity here. I need to make sure I'm holding space at some time in the future to try to match that rest productivity. So again, this question of how do you align the opportunities to reorient criteria for success and innovation in your research and institution as a productive and valuable use of your time? Thinking of this as decolonization work, but thinking of this as a productive use of time, of resources, of energy, of thinking. And what ends up being really nice is that when you ask this question for yourself, you develop your own response to justifying and advocating for this as you navigate the institutions, the programming, the structures that you will need to in order to shift this in your work outputs. And this is why, like, I'm really big into reflection questions and processing those reflection questions however suits you. Some people like to go on a walk. Some people like to write a poem. Some people I like to make art. I make ribbon skirts when I'm processing these kind of questions. And so I'm sewing in the art of creating and processing. I also journal a lot. So I make a lot of mind maps where I start with these questions in the middle of a page. And I would say too, like, if you take anything away from this session, it would be great if you chose maybe 1 or 2 reflection questions to actually engage with, because the impact of this session is only going to be realized through the commitment that you make to anything that I shared today. That isn't my responsibility. I've created the opportunity and I've done my best to do so. And that's my responsibility, to create the opportunity to learn and to grow. But that responsibility now shifts to you in terms of how you apply and how you use that opportunity. And so I have tried my best to create a very kind of practical approach to that. Let me just acknowledge first, lots of resources. If you're looking for the evidence, if you're looking for just deeper knowledge in terms of anything that I've talked about today. And so you're going to see that in this kind of final section. But let me get back to here. But really what I wanted to do today is to, illuminate this idea of worldview hierarchies, and to, again, position them and ourselves in these legacies of colonialism. And to me, I find this understanding, this research, this history so empowering, because when we're better able to position ourselves, we're better able to identify what we can do to move towards the just, sustainable futures that we're all working towards. And so that's what I really wanted to do as we kind of navigated settler colonialism conversation, as we then kind of transitioned into conversation about decolonization and indigenization as innovation. I talked about success and reorienting our understanding of success and research success. And then in this last section, a critical exploration. So what does it look like to practically do this work, to engage with these reflection questions? It can really start in our minds and in our spaces by acknowledging that this work is productive, that this work is innovative. And I've always found that a relationship to time and looking there can help us create the foundation to actually do this work from the heart out. Now, I want to acknowledge, as I wrap up, my mentors who really supported me in understanding a lot of this work. So Dr. Lauren Foster, he's a leading expert in Canada with regards to race-based data collection. and analysis. And actually, he was my supervisor on that project that I spoke about. He really helped me navigate a lot of that. And then also Ruth Green, who's also at York University, one of my first Indigenous kind of mentors in an institutional space. And she really, really helped me in navigating all of this work as well. And really helped me navigate these barriers in really practical ways. Now, I met both of these people, and life-changing people, beginning with this question of what can I do for you? In both cases, I used to go to sessions like this every single month throughout my entire degree. And I would always, kind of like how I do with books, I would always go to every other session had to be one that was outside of my field of expertise or interest. And in doing that, I met these two over the course of my degree. And at the end of the session, I always went up and asked, what can I do for you? And as this little undergrad student, what I was doing is positioning myself as having valuable qualifications and experience to contribute to the work that they're doing. I recognize all the ways I could benefit from working with you, but also I want to position myself as being someone who also can contribute value to what you are doing and your mission. This was where I was able to establish a basis for reciprocal mentorship. And in doing this work, and again, seeing such a diverse range of people and roles in this space, asking yourself first, what can you contribute, especially as students? How does your lived experience, how does your perspective, how do your insights really position you as having value in this work? And then for those who are approached by mentees or prospective mentees, really ask yourself, how are you honoring that qualification? How are you honoring that they too are adding value to your work? And there is an opportunity to be mentored by them. This question of what I can do, what can I do for you, is a really simple way that I was able to open those doors and open that kind of reciprocal nature in my mentorship relationships that led to, again, the most life-changing impacts I've had in mentor relationships. So again, lots of resources. I know I dumped a lot of really big concepts, oftentimes very charged concepts. And I know many of you have already engaged with them. You may have engaged with them a little differently today, but I hope it was accessible. I try my best to make this work accessible, to make this work compassionate, and to make this work empowering in understanding that you have, every one of us has a role and has a superpower in this work. We all are qualified to do this work, but it's about understanding and positioning ourselves in that work that really can. And when we really do that, we really see the opportunity for innovation. And again, a way that goes beyond technological advancements, in a way that goes beyond the research, and that really creates the space for that application of pre-colonial contact, knowledge and experiences, of our lived experiences as a qualifying contributor to our understanding of innovation and the way that we pursue it. So with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hang out here for about 15 more minutes, 20 more minutes. If you want to chat, talk, more Q&As, I'm happy to sit down with any of you. If you're finishing up your food too, you can come sit over at our table. But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I appreciate being here. I appreciate all the work. Vicky, you've been incredible in working together. She's really held my hand. I'm a little difficult to coordinate with just because I'm very busy and my head really hurts. So I have to be careful with how much time I spend on emails. And Vicky's been just incredibly patient with me. So thank you for this space. Thank you for sharing it with me. And I look forward to any conversations that come out of this.
Wow. Thanks so much, Larissa. I mean, I've sat down there and I've learned so much today. And one of the things, those on my team, you know, I'm an engineer by training, right? And engineers like to measure things. Engineers like to have metrics. And, you know, that whole discussion about time orientation, things that get measured get done is kind of my perspective on things, but are they being done well? Are they being done with quality? One of the things I do relate to as an engineer, though, in dealing with Indigenous communities, it needs to be about the engagement and the relationship building longer term. So what are we doing iteratively to maintain those relationships and to continue to invest in them? That's something that I got out of this. So thanks so much for that. After the last session, I learned some things there too. So we've been really focused on decarbonized transportation and really accelerating our research activities in that area. And after the last session, Julie Wildgoose from Inspire came up and talked to me, and she said, you know, as an Indigenous community member, we are really concerned about decarbonized transportation. I'm thinking, what? It's a fantastic thing. It's going to be less harmful on the environment, less greenhouse gases, all of that. No, we're really concerned about the equitable, safe, and reliable transportation that we're going to see in remote Indigenous communities. And as people need to travel from community to community, we're concerned that some of the decarbonized transportation options aren't going to be reliable. I thought, wow, what an insight. And what are we doing within our research team to start to really focus on that? And since the last session, thankfully for her perspective on that, we are getting engaged in exactly that. So how do we champion reliable, sustainable, equitable transportation for remote communities as we go into transit options for the future, be it hydrogen, electrical powered, et cetera. Today's session was suggested to me. Vicky and I do regular one-on-ones, and Vicky said you have to have Larissa come in and speak. She's absolutely fantastic. I heard her at University of Guelph when I was doing my master's, and based on Vicky's just very solid recommendation, we planned today's session, and Larissa, you hit it out of the park. So thank you so much. I learned so much. You were really engaging, very practical, but just loved it. Vicky, since this was your idea, I want to invite you up now and for a couple of comments and just to give Larissa a token of our appreciation for coming here with us today.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And thank you so much, Larissa, for being here today. Thank you all for taking your time to come. I know it's early in the morning and you folks, I'm sure, have lots of things on your plate, but being here really means a lot to the work that Centennial is doing in innovation and how we can build a better world. And Larissa, you being here today, I think that everyone in the room learned so much from you. We were all really inspired and empowered, which I knew we would be. And I just want to thank you. I don't have a script for this, but I just want to say that, you know, your change leadership inspires and empowers our change leadership. And at Centennial, we want to build more change leaders and to empower other communities that are marginalized or don't have the voices to empower themselves as of yet. So thank you and thank you.
Okay. So with that, our next session is going to be in April. We're going to pivot a little bit, and we're going to be talking about accessibility. So the last two sessions have focused on Indigenous perspectives in research and how are we inclusive in that. I think it's very important to ensure that we're inclusive as far as accessibility goes. And so Daniel Huizinga is working with a couple of research partners that we have in the local community, and we'll look forward to seeing you on April 11th. Thanks everybody for coming today.